All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for coming today to the wonderful webinar by our lovely Jamie-Lynn here. She's going to be talking to us today about self-compassion for women in business. Before we get into that, just a little bit of housekeeping. As you saw when you opened up the webinar, there was a disclaimer. We ask that during the presentation, you do keep yourself on mute, but during the question periods, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself. This is being recorded. So if you do not wish to be part of the recording, feel free to turn off your camera. If you also have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I can relay them to Jamie. But just a little bit about her. She is the CEO of Aura, the Physiotherapy Center. Sorry, I haven't had enough caffeine. I'm stumbling over my words. But after 10 years in social services, one trend that she's noticed is a reluctance from people to reach out for support around their emotional health when they need it. There are so many reasons for this, but they all boil down to one truth. People are suffering in silence. That's where the dream for Aura, psychotherapy. I was like, not physio. Psychotherapy Center began. Her goal is to make accessing a psychotherapy easy, comfortable, and safe. She's passionate about normalizing psychotherapy in our society, and she strives every day to create a safe space where anyone in Ontario can access a professional, compassionate, empathetic therapist who will work with them to help them achieve their therapy goals. And with all that, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kylie. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate those who've joined us today. I'm so excited about this topic, and I was really looking forward to sharing this information with you. So, self-compassion for women in business. So I'm going to start off today with some overview, some general information. It is a lot to jam into an hour, so bear with me as I fly through it. That being said, I love when people engage and ask questions. We often remember and connect with information a lot better when we are, talking about it with people. So feel free at any time. I'm happy to pause and answer questions. And then we're going to wrap up with, how does this apply for women in business? What can self-compassion do for female entrepreneurs? So to get started, I'm going to encourage you all to join me in a bit of an exercise. So the image on the screen is a woman by the name of Dr. Shauna Shapiro. Dr. Shapiro is a psychologist who has spent her career really focusing and doing a lot of research and education around mindfulness. And she has a book called Good Morning, I Love You. And the book is actually named after a practice that she encourages folks to try in their own lives. And the practice is starting your morning off by placing a hand on your heart and saying to yourself, good morning, I love you. So I just really invite you all to join me in doing that practice. And I know that it sounds a bit silly, certainly, for some folks to hear that, but there is actually research behind doing things like this. When we place our hand on our heart, we're offering our body a compassionate touch. Our brain doesn't necessarily recognize that it's not us, like ourselves, providing that touch. And so when it feels your own hand over your heart, not only does it give you a sense of empowerment, but it also connects with your body and your brain function. And it really taps into, your dopamine receptors, oxytocin, which are all those feel-good emotions. So when you place your hand on your heart and you say, good morning, I love you. Sometimes I say my name. So good morning, I love you, Jamie-Lynn. This really starts your day off from a place of personal investment and empowerment. So I encourage you all to try that. One of the things Dr. Shauna Shapiro talks about is what we practice grows stronger. So our brain is, an incredible organ that really is able to shape itself and adapt to whatever we challenge it with. So when we practice things over and over and over and over again, our brain adapts to that practice and embraces it as part of a well-functioning system. So when you do this practice every day, and a lot of the other practices I'll talk about today, it's important to invest in incorporating it into your everyday life. So first and foremost, what is compassion? So the image on the screen is of Dr. Kristin Neff. Dr. Kristin Neff is another psychologist, and her entire focus in her career has been, what is self-compassion? She's the leading researcher in North America on this topic. And basically basically anyone in this field, if you know or have questions about self-compassion, selfcompassion.org, Kristen Neff's website, is generally where you start off. So compassion involves the recognition and clear seeing of suffering. It also involves feelings of kindness for people who are suffering, so that the desire to help to ameliorate suffering emerges. Finally, compassion involves recognizing our shared human condition, flawed and fragile as it is. Self-compassion, by definition, involves the same qualities. So when she starts this conversation with folks, she encourages people to think about self-compassion in terms of, how do we provide compassion to other people in our lives? Generally, what that looks like when a friend comes to you and is seeking your support, you're offering understanding, you're offering kindness, you're offering support, love, warmth, a hug if they need it. And self-compassion is learning how to take that skill and apply it to yourself. So there are a couple of other people who have great quotes on this that I'm just going to touch on. This one is again by Kristen Neff. And I found this one in Brene Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart, which is her most recent publication. Self-compassion entails being warm and understanding towards ourselves when we suffer, fail, or feel inadequate, rather than ignoring our pain or flagellating ourselves with self-criticism. Self-compassionate people recognize that being imperfect and failing and experiencing life difficulties are completely inevitable. So they tend to be gentle with themselves when confronted with painful experiences, rather than getting angry when life falls short of set ideals. We learn to bring kindness, affection, and tenderness to our own suffering. We discover that we can be on our own team instead of berating or rejecting ourselves. We can even learn to be kind to ourselves when we're in the wrong, not because we're letting ourselves off the hook, but because we're hurting. Self-compassion offers a radical approach. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love and kindness. And that one is from Shauna Shapiro from her book, Good Morning, I Love You. So we've talked a little bit about what is it, but why is self-compassion so important? One of the key things that stands out for me is shame resilience. And this is a topic that Brene Brown is a big speaker on. One of Brene Brown's quotes on shame is, "Shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we're capable of change." What we now know through research is self-compassion is actually the key antidote to shame. And this is important because shame is something that we don't, shame doesn't motivate us. Shame doesn't do anything positive for us. Shame is just the feeling that, I'm a bad person, and really equating our whole being with negativity. Self-compassion says that you're worthy of love and kindness and belonging, regardless of your flaws, regardless of your mistakes. And so when we find ourselves in a shame web, it's really important to challenge ourselves and to offer ourselves comfort and tenderness and kindness and understanding, right? When we suffer, we tend to go into that shame place. And so offering our self-compassion can bring us out of that. When we feel shame, the amygdala, right, the part of our brain that is central to memory, decision-making, and emotional responses, triggers a cascade of norepinephrine. I always say that wrong. It's a big word. Sorry, guys. And cortisol. These are chemicals that truly increase our stress levels. They narrow our perspective on perceived threats and inhibit our cognitive flexibility. So more big reasons why it's important to work against shame, right? Shame literally puts us into fight, flight, or freeze, a state that negatively impacts the learning centers of the brain. So therefore, we are really unable to learn when we're stuck in that shame spot. Some other really great quotes about why this is such an important practice. We need to see how the habit of constant self-judgment diminishes our life force, steals our inner peace, and crushes our souls. And that one's by Frank Ostesky. And then Kristen again, unlike self-criticism, which asks if you're good enough, self-compassion asks what's good for you. A key piece of self-compassion is consistently asking yourself, what do I need right now? And then trying to meet that need as best you can. So this is something that I just think is such an important thing to consider. I'll never let anyone walk through my mind with their dirty feet, which is a quote by Mahatma Gandhi. And basically, the idea behind this quote is just saying, we often separate ourselves from others and their negativity. We're much better able to identify toxic people in our life these days and to say, this isn't serving me a purpose. Perhaps I need to think about whether this person belongs in my life or not. Or at the very least, really considering whether their negativity is something we want to allow to walk through our mind. While this is true, what's interesting to me is that although we don't often allow others to walk through our mind with their dirty feet, we often walk through our own minds with our dirty feet, providing ourselves with significant judgment and criticism. And doing that really hinders our ability to succeed. So, one of the things I wanted to touch on today was some studies that I find super, super interesting. Um, and the first one is a study done by Duke University, and this was done by Mark Leary and his colleagues, and it demonstrated truly how powerful self-compassion can be. In this study, female dieters were given a donut and asked to eat it. Half of these participants were told that several people have told me they feel bad about eating donuts in this study. So I hope you won't be too hard on yourself. The control group, the other set of folks in this study, were told nothing. The researchers found that those who were in the control group were very hard on themselves after eating the donut. They reported feeling guilty and ashamed, where participants who were encouraged to be self compassionate were much kinder to themselves. Much more interesting about the study is that later on, they were all offered to eat as much candy as they wanted as part of a taste testing. The folks who were offered self compassionate statements actually ate less candy than those in the control group, really sending the message that when we're compassionate to ourselves around our suffering and our mistakes and our failures, we tend to be in a better place to make healthier decisions for ourselves. Another really interesting study was done at the University of California, Berkeley. Researchers administered an incredibly hard spelling test that all students failed. Half the students were encouraged to be self-compassionate, right? Try not to be too hard on yourself, they were told. Or it's common for students to have difficulty with these types of tests. The other half of the control group were given statements designed to boost their self-esteem. You must be intelligent if you got into Berkeley, was what they were told. The students who were encouraged to be self-compassionate ended up being more successful on the next test. In contrast, the students offered self-esteem boosting statements were more affected by their previous failure and felt it completely futile to study. So they didn't study, right? So the lead researcher in this study, Juliana Brains, summarized the findings by stating, we found that people who were taught to be kind to themselves felt more motivated to see their mistakes as a chance for growth, right? How interesting is that? Another great example of where people who practice self-compassion actually are easily able to dive in and be more motivated in their endeavors, right? When we act with self-compassion, we trigger the release of oxytocin, the love hormone, and this generates feelings of safety and connection and endorphins, which are our natural feel-good neurotransmitters, right? This is the stuff we want to activate in our brain. It helps us have a good positive outlook throughout the day. So, this really leads us into this conversation about what can self-compassion offer us that self-esteem cannot, right? Self-esteem really needs success to prove your self-worth. Whereas self-compassion says you are worthy no matter what. And that's a quote by Shauna Shapiro. Self-esteem tends to be unstable because it changes with our successes and failures, constantly rising and falling. Self-compassion, on the other hand, can remain a constant, always because it is based in accepting ourselves as we are and loving that flawed, imperfect person that you are. In her book, Self-Compassion, the Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself, Kristen Neff references a review that was completed on self-esteem literature that concluded that high self-esteem actually did not improve academic achievement, job performance, or leadership skills. It also found that self-esteem did not prevent children from smoking, drinking, taking drugs, and engaging in early sex, right? Which is largely why we invested millions and millions of dollars into self-esteem programs in schools, because we thought that's what it would do for kids. If anything, high self esteem appears to be the consequence rather than the cause of healthy behaviors. So, for the last many years, we've put this huge focus in our societies on self esteem and helping people improve their self esteem. This has been done in workplaces, in schools, in different organizations across the country. We've invested tons of money into this programming, but we've started. So, an example of that is everyone gets a trophy, right? I'm sure people have heard this stuff that sometimes happens with, soccer organizations and hockey organizations these days, is sort of house league teams. Everybody gets a trophy. And this encourages people to be positive about themselves as much as possible. While this is well intended, we've really learned that self esteem lacks some important tools, right? So, what happens when we give everybody a trophy is we don't teach people how to love themselves when they fail. We don't teach folks that, failure is an inevitable part of life. When you go through your life, you are going to struggle and fail and have hardships over and over and over again. And if we don't equip folks, especially our youngsters, with the tools to deal with their failures, we are really setting them up for, a really difficult life. Social cliques are another great example of how self-esteem operates in a very negative way. We sometimes think that we need to build the self-esteem up in a bully. The problem with this is that the bully gets their self-esteem boosted when they bully others. It's this power over instead of power with mentality, which is very problematic. People with high self-esteem are more likely to gather in cliques, whether in high schools or adult workplaces. These cliques function on the basis that they believe they're better than others, than outsiders, if you will. Their self-esteem is often boosted by being members of this group, but they tend not to be so kind, right, and compassionate or understanding to members who are not part of the group. So, continuing this sort of examination of self-compassion versus self-esteem, in one study, college students were told they did worse than average on an intelligence test. Those with high self-esteem tended to compensate for the bad news by insulting the other study participants and putting them down. Those with low self-esteem, on the other hand, tended to react by being nicer and complimenting other participants as a way to seem more likable. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure I would much rather spend my time with folks who are willing to compliment me rather than put me down for failing, right? Self esteem is built on our evaluation of our self worth and comparing ourselves to other. It's a judgment we make about ourselves. Often we have been taught that to have self esteem means to feel special or above average. This is problematic because it's impossible for any of us to be above average all of the time, right? We certainly all have moments in our life where we are special and we are incredibly talented at something, but this isn't something that happens every day in our lives. The goal of self esteem and self compassion are polar opposites. One is about getting it right, the other is about opening our hearts, which is a quote by Kristen Neff from her book, Fierce Self Compassion, which I really appreciate. So, the constant losing battle that is perfectionism. So, similarly to self esteem issues, perfectionism is another problem that's very much connected to self esteem. Self esteem, when we're striving to improve our self esteem, most often people are striving to reach perfection, which we know is really an unattainable goal. And to sort of bring that home, I've quoted some pieces of Brene Brown's very thorough definition on perfectionism. And this is found in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, on page 57. And what she says is perfectionism is self destructive and addictive. Belief system that fuels the primary thought: if I look perfect, live perfectly, and do everything perfectly, I can avoid or minimize the painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. is self-destructive simply because there is no such thing as perfection. It is also more about how others perceive you to be rather than what you actually are, right? So when we're striving to be perfect, it's about having other people see us that way, not necessarily ourselves seeing ourselves as perfect. Perfectionism is addictive because when we invariably do experience shame, judgment, and blame, we often believe it's because we weren't perfect enough. When we don't question this, we become entrenched in our desire and hustle to be perfect. Feeling shamed, judged, and blamed, and the fear of these feelings are realities of the human experience. Perfectionism actually increases the odds that we'll experience these painful emotions and often leads to self blame. So the antidote to perfectionism is self-compassion. Crazy, eh? But seriously, practicing self-compassion really helps us to accept and love ourselves regardless of our imperfections, right? It allows us to say, you are a deeply flawed human, but you are still worthy of kindness, love, understanding, support. And it really allows us to acknowledge and embrace that truth. Shauna Shapiro talks about what are some of the 5 roadblocks to self compassion. And I thought this was really important to bring up because many people, throughout my time doing this work and teaching people, mostly my clients, about self compassion, I've been presented with many of these 5. So the first is it undermines our motivation. So often we believe that if we aren't harsh and tough on ourselves when we make a mistake, we will lose motivation to work harder. Research has actually shown the opposite to be true. It tells us that when we offer ourselves compassion instead of criticism, we become more invested to learn and understand how the mistake happened and then take steps to correct it or grow in that area. Number 2 is the belief that being self compassionate to ourselves is selfish. Self compassion is truly the most generous thing we can do, not only to ourselves, but to all of the people around us. When we are caring, understanding, kind, tender, gentle with ourselves, when we pay attention to our needs and take care of them appropriately, we actually end up being much healthier, happier people and more easily able to invest and offer love and compassion to others in our life. Number 3 is the idea that it is self indulgent. Self compassion is not self indulgent in any way. It's literally us meeting one of our own needs. And our needs are not indulgent. They're like right in the word. We need that stuff, right? Number 4, it undermines responsibility and integrity. Being self-compassionate towards ourselves does not mean that we're not accountable for our mistakes. It doesn't give us a get out of jail free card. It just necessarily means that when we make mistakes, we care for ourselves, we comfort ourselves, which then actually motivates us to take the steps needed to make amends. This is how integrity is maintained. Where none of us are perfect human beings, so to have integrity, we have to not only do the right thing, even when no one's looking, but we also have to be willing to acknowledge our mistakes and make amends for them while offering ourselves compassion, right? And support and comfort for making the mistake. Number 5 is the idea that self compassion is weak. Our society has a real history of labeling healthy pieces of us as weak. So, for example, for many, many years, we have believed and sent the message across in society that being vulnerable is weak. And very similar with self compassion, this idea that it's us falling victim to weakness. It's actually not true. It takes a lot of courage to take the time to be vulnerable and to be compassionate to yourself. And when we choose to buck up or tough it out instead of care for ourselves and acknowledge that more vulnerable experience, we stuff or bottle up our emotions. And that's really problematic because when we bottle or we avoid in some way, we tend to do so in really unhealthy coping ways, right? Whether it's substance abuse or other unhealthy behaviors. avoidance is always going to lead us to that emotion coming out at a different time and probably not the greatest way. So it's really important that we allow ourselves the opportunity to practice vulnerability, to practice self-compassion. So diving deeper into self-compassion itself, Kristen Neff has broken it down into 3 areas. So there's 3 key parts of being compassionate to yourself. The first is mindfulness, self-kindness is the second, and common humanity is the third. And I'm actually going to start off by visiting self-kindness. So, what is self kindness? Well, it's the act of being kind to yourself instead of being self critical or judgmental. Pretty self explanatory. There's a focus on understanding our failures and struggles so we can learn and grow from them. And more so than the obvious stuff is self kindness in terms of self compassion is actively comforting ourselves, putting an arm around your own shoulder, so to speak, and saying, this is hard. It hurts. What do I need right now to comfort myself? And then giving ourselves that. When we fail or make big mistakes, most of us end up in a real big web of shame, as we chatted about earlier. But what if we chose to be kind to ourselves instead? Self kindness generates oxytocin in our brains, that feel good hormone, right? And can really make a big difference in the level of suffering we experience when hardships come. Marshall Rosenberg, author of best-selling book Nonviolent Communication, emphasizes the importance of speaking kindly to ourselves and reframing our inner dialogue so we express empathy for our basic human needs. He suggests we use these 4 questions. And I would really encourage you to sit in a moment of mindfulness, right? Sit with yourself in the quiet and ask yourself these things. What am I observing? What am I feeling? And what am I needing right now? Do I have a request of myself or someone else to have a need met? And then it's thinking about how can I go about and do those things in a healthy way. So I have another practice I'd love for us to do together. So I'm going to read an excerpt out of Kristen Neff's book, Self-Compassion, and it's a practice that she created called the hugging practice. So feel free to do this along with us as I read, but I just encourage you all to give yourself a loving, warm, tender hug. And this is what what Kristen has outlined the practice to be. One easy way to soothe and comfort yourself when you're feeling badly is to give yourself a gentle hug. It seems a bit silly at first, but your body doesn't know that. It just responds to the physical gesture of warmth and care, just as a baby responds to being held in its mother's arms. Our skin is an incredibly sensitive organ, and research indicates that physical touch releases oxytocin, provides a sense of security, soothes distressing emotions, and calms our cardiovascular stress. So why not try it? So I hope that all of you are giving yourself a great big hug right now. You deserve it. And again, I know just like the first exercise, it does feel a little silly to give yourself a hug, but I encourage you to keep trying it. The more that you do that, the more that it feels, more normal, and the more you'll accept the practice, and the more it will really start to work with your brain neurotransmitters to give you those overall feelings of warmth and love and support. So the second piece that I'm going to talk about in terms of the 3 pieces of self-compassion is common humanity. So compassion literally means to suffer with, right? The emotion of compassion springs from recognition that the human experience is totally imperfect. Why else would we say it's only human to comfort someone who's made a mistake, right? When we remember this important fact and we suffer, we begin to remind ourselves that suffering, mistakes, failures, they occur by all people, that we are not alone in our suffering. The pain I feel in difficult times is the same pain you feel in difficult times. The triggers are different, the circumstances are different, the degree of pain is different, but the process is the same. It's when we're practicing this idea about common humanity, it's the encouragement that is vastly seen across society and to improve one's self-esteem has negatively contributed to the social comparison problem, right? So that's not what common humanity is. I just want to make that distinct difference. It's really not comparing your situation to anyone else's. Because self-esteem requires us to feel special and above average to feel worthy, we often get stuck in emotions like insecurity when those around us are successful and we are not. This leads us to distance ourselves from them. This is something that I have seen a lot, especially with women and entrepreneurship, but in a lot of other areas with women as well. You know, the society that we live in socializes us in such a way that we are expected to be passive. We're expected to be agreeable. We're expected to be caretakers, the runners of homes, you know, caring for our children and our families. And that's really problematic for a lot of reasons. But obviously, when we as women become entrepreneurs, that's very problematic because the things and the qualities that we bring to the table are often overlooked. You know, business world is a more of a competitive, fierce atmosphere. And because there's also so much sexism still in the business world, women feel so much pressure to succeed. Sometimes that leads us to do kind of unhealthy things, right? One of which is feel insecure and jealous of other women who are successful rather than rooting for them. So I just want to take a look at another research study that Kristen F. refers to. Researchers told participants that they were assessing student interest in and knowledge of various topics of an upcoming student college bowl competition. Students thought they were being tested in pairs, but the other student in the pair was really part of the research team. A mock competition was held, and students fielded a series of questions about topics such as rock music or football. The experimenters told students either that they had outperformed their partner or else that their partner had outperformed them. Next, experimenters assessed how close participants felt to their study partner by asking how much they thought they had in common and how much they wanted to work with that partner in the future. They even looked at how physically close they sat to their partner when both were moved to another room. And what they found was when people found that the other partner did much better than they did, they kept their distance, right? They really stayed away from and chose not to engage with those folks. And that's a really problematic situation because people who are successful are a resource to us. And not only that, we are better in our own mental health and our own well-being when we root for others to succeed too. The last thing I'll say about common humanity is when we suffer and when we're in pain, to be able to say to ourselves, I am not alone. You know, I am not the first person who's felt this. I'm not the first person who's gone through this experience, and I won't be the last, is such an important piece. When we don't have that, we often feel isolated and alone. And when we feel isolated and alone, things become a lot more overwhelming and stressful than they need to be. If we can say to ourselves, I am part of a larger whole, you know, I am part of a common humanity, and many other people have experienced this just like me, and I do not have to feel alone. And the last piece is mindfulness. So I'm sure many people have heard about mindfulness. It's kind of a bit of a buzzword in our society these days. And I tried to sort of pick pieces of it that I think are really important. The first is just this incredible quote: "You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." So the idea behind mindfulness is, you know, we can't control the world around us. We can't control the struggle and strife that sometimes we face. What we can control is how we sort of ride the waves, if you will, how we learn to surf. To give ourselves compassion, we must first have to recognize that we're suffering. We can't heal what we can't feel, right? And so being able to sit with ourselves and acknowledge that we are suffering offers this opportunity to give ourselves compassion, to comfort ourselves. When something painful happens to us, whether it's criticizing ourselves in the mirror or being told by a boss that our performance is under par, we tend to focus on the failure itself rather than the pain caused by the failure. When we focus only on the failure itself, we don't acknowledge our suffering or do anything about it. This often leads to worry, stress, and feelings of overwhelm later, right? That bottling up that sometimes we do, that's really not healthy for us. Dr. Gabor Mate has said many, many times that in order to be with our pain, we must sense some sort of compassion. He also talks a lot about how in our society, we strive hard to avoid anything that feels painful or uncomfortable. And that's really problematic. When we try to avoid things, we often cope in unhealthy, counterproductive ways. And I really want you to think of this equation: pain times resistance equals suffering. So the more we avoid, the more we resist our pain, the more suffering we actually endure. So we're doing a big disservice to ourselves. And let's just be honest, we live in a society of avoidance. We are avoiders. And I really encourage you to challenge yourself to work on that habit. Whether we're avoiding painful emotions, avoiding tough conversations, avoiding, taking the next step in our business because we have fear. We are avoiding dealing with the pain of our reality. And mindfulness says, sit with your pain, be with your pain, be present with your pain, When we notice our pain without exaggerating it, this is a moment of mindfulness. Mindfulness entails observing what is going on in our field of awareness, just as it is right here, right now. No embellishing, nothing extra special. Just really acknowledging that pain and being with it. Mindfulness is the act of being present with ourselves. We can practice being mindful throughout our day in a variety of different ways. So when people hear the word mindfulness, sometimes they jump right to mindful meditation, which is absolutely a helpful practice, and something that's really helpful when we practice it every day, first thing in the morning or once in the evening, or at any point in the day that you can find time. But there's also ways that we can be mindful throughout our day, even on your drive to work. Mindfulness is just the practice of being present. So often we spend our time worrying about the past or the future, and those are the things that we are anxious or nervous about, past issues or future issues. If we practice being present, for example, what that can look like on our drive to work is really, sitting with ourselves and asking ourselves as we drive, how do I feel in my body? How does my bum feel on the seat that I'm sitting on? How does, my hands feel around the steering wheel? What does the road look like in front of me? What can I describe to myself about my current being, my current state of being? And that's really an opportunity for us to really connect with our body, connect with our mind, our heart, our spirit, and say, what's going on for me right now? Kristen Neff also talks about how mindfulness is often seen as a meta awareness, which means awareness of awareness. The example she offers to illustrate this is we can often feel anger, but then we can be aware that we're feeling anger. And the latter of that, being aware that we're feeling anger, requires mindfulness. So just in the essence of time, I will, at the end of the presentation, I'll pop this link into the chat box. But this is a link to take you to test your level of self-compassion. And usually in my workshops, I get folks to do this, and then we have a discussion about people's scores. And generally what we find is most folks flood themselves with self-criticism and self-judgment, and they don't even recognize that they're doing it. It happens so quickly that it's actually hard to pinpoint what's happening. So I really encourage you all to take a moment after today's presentation and visit the link. This is found on Kristen Knapp's website, selfcompassion.org. So if you're not able to access the chat box, if you're seeing this recording later, please visit the website and take the test. So now's the fun stuff. I love this part. So why is this such an important skill for women in business? So I'm going to start that conversation by reading an excerpt from Kristen's book, Fierce Self-Compassion. And I would really encourage any female entrepreneur, this is what it looks like, to pick up this book. Kristen really talks about some important pieces of the struggles we face as women in the workplace, in the workforce, and all the sexism that we come up against and things that we can do to help ourselves. But this is one of the excerpts that I found very helpful. So she says, one of the reasons it's essential for women to develop fierce self-compassion is because expressing power in a meaningful way is limited to gender role stereotypes, which represent society's conventional view of what men and women are like. In most cultures, females are considered communal and males agentic. These stereotypes map closely to the qualities of yin tenderness and yang fierceness, right? Yin being more female, communal attributes, and males being that more agentic yang fierceness. Women are seen as sensitive, warm, cooperative, and concerned with the welfare of others, where men are seen as strong, aggressive, goal-oriented, and independent. In other words, tenderness is a chick thing, and fierceness is seen as a dude thing. And she says, you can substitute another word that starts with D and rhymes with chick, if you like, if you like. Just a little bit of humor from her. But I think the importance here is that what society tells us in this, males being agentic and female communal is really untrue, and I bet many of you female entrepreneurs can connect with that. Often a lot of females relate with more agentic attributes, right? That fierceness, goal-oriented, being strong, aggressive, and independent. We see a lot of women connecting with that. We also see a lot of men now connecting more with the communal side. So we really need to use compassion to care for ourselves, right? With this whole issue that still occurs in society. And then also, Kristen talks about using fierce self-compassion to harness our anger around these situations in a constructive way, to change the system. So Kristen talks about the goal is to have a balanced yin and yang. And this is important to have in our own life, but I think it's hugely important in businesses. And as leaders of businesses, many of us have employees or other team members that work with us. And it's really, really important that in a healthy workplace, we see both tender and fierce qualities in a workplace. So because we as women are socialized to be much more communal, often we need to offer ourselves self-compassion and embrace some of our more agentic characteristics. If the opposite is true for us when we try to balance out our agentic sides with more communal attributes, right? So again, this conversation about bringing both equal pieces to the world of business. And in the world of business, we need both of these sides of ourselves to push through the sexism we face. And reach our goals. We also have to use this knowledge to navigate society's systems differently. So, for example, I'm sure many people can relate to this, many females can relate to this. But often, if you are an assertive or very strong, goal-oriented female, maybe you've been approached and heard the term bossy, right? So this is something I really relate to. I'm a very assertive, strong woman, and I run two different businesses. And when I have to be assertive, and I would say, this most often happens with men, but it's happened with women too, because women face the same socialization in the society, right? I've been called things like a bitch or bossy. It seems like it's a very difficult thing for there to be a space for women in this society that way. So we need self-compassion in those moments to say, ugh, it's so hard that someone called you that, you know? Like I would say to myself, Jamie-Lynn, it's really hard that someone said that to you. And it must hurt that people see you that way. And, you know, asking myself, what can you give yourself to help you through this difficult moment? When we do this for ourselves, we're more than easily able to step back, take care of ourselves, but then harness that fierce self compassion for constructive change. So, as I mentioned, this yin and yang, we really are about balancing out unhealthy environments. Traditionally, the masculine world we live in is all about ferocity and action. It's all about profits and pushing forward to get ahead of competitors. And most often, businesses are so heavily focused on profits that their only goal in considering employee well being is increasing salary. We're hearing so much about this now about salary is great. And really important, especially in our current economic climate. But employee well being is so much more than that. And many of us have lots of employees. You know, not only is this important for ourselves as business owners, it's important for us to think about how this can positively impact our staff. These environments don't leave any space for things like kindness, acceptance, and understanding. And the result of this is that the yin and yang are out of balance. We need female entrepreneurs and leaders in our society more now than ever before. We as women have a unique ability to bring ferocity, ambition, tenacity, along with our more tender sides of kindness and compassion. And when we do this, we create healthier, more productive workplaces where employees feel valued and able to continually grow. So for you leaders in business, you know, as business owners and leaders in our workplaces across the country, we can not only help provide balanced environments that contribute to healthy employees, but we can use self-compassion to advance our businesses forward. We all know that creating a successful business means acknowledging our failures and learning to grow from these to achieve better for ourselves in future. The research shows that the more we offer ourselves self-compassion, the more able we are to be resilient from failure and to succeed. So in some of the studies I shared today, it illustrated that when we're self-compassionate to ourselves when we struggle or fail, we tend to take a step back and then leap forward far better than we could have if we were improving our self-esteem or if we weren't being either one of those things at all. When we are taking best care of ourselves, we can pour higher quality energy into our businesses to continue succeeding in this patriarchal society that we live in. Oh, my apologies. I am recovering from a cold. So in Kristen Neff's book, Fear Self-Compassion, she talks about practices women can use around anger to help us harness our anger for that greater good. So usually in the workshops I do offer a tender self-compassion break. Unfortunately, due to time, I just don't have time to do that with you guys today because I do want to get to questions. But I encourage you to visit her website and check it out. Oh, I apologize. I have a tickle. So here are some of my resources. And again, thank you so much for being part of this information session today. It was such an honor for me to share this with you. And that's really all I have for you. Is there any question?
I have one. Um, Sorry, can you put those resources back up again? I'd love to get a screenshot of that, and I didn't get to.
The good thing my body saved all the coughing for the end.
That was a really great presentation. Thank you. You've given us so much to think about here.
Oh, thank you so much for that feedback. I really appreciate that. I also just want to put up my contact information as well. If anybody wants to continue this conversation, please feel free to reach out to me.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie-Lynn, for coming and giving this fabulous presentation today. I know our other girls had to leave a little bit early, but they wanted to say thank you, and it was a wonderful presentation as well. Once again, thank you so much for coming. And if anybody would like a copy of today's presentation, they can send me an email at communications@pero.ca. I'll put it in the chat for you here, and I can send you a copy of the recording once it is available. Thank you so much again, everybody, for coming, and you have a fabulous rest of your day.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me, Pero.